Welcome back, everyone. We're here again in my apartment in Queens, New York, continuing our 5-day-a-week broadcast on this coronavirus, this CCP virus. Before we get started, if you haven't seen the new documentary we released, check it out. I have it in the channel. It's in the video section. It's an investigative documentary between Epoch Times and NTD Television, our sister media. And we've looked into the origins of this virus. I think you'll all find it very interesting. Be sure to check it out. With that said, let's jump into the updates for today. Now, you may remember I've been talking for a while that the Chinese Communist Party said it would reopen Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus, on April 8th. April 8th came. The Chinese Communist Party did open it to an extent, not fully. And there was a large exodus of people out of Wuhan. There was traffic jams, lines of cars trying to get out, and people on foot trying to get out. The Epoch Times also conducted some interviews. As I've mentioned before, we are proudly blacklisted in China, but we do have sources on the ground, and we do conduct phone interviews into China. So people in Wuhan told us that they're leaving the city as fast as possible because they're afraid that the Chinese regime will lock down the city again. And this is not misplaced fear. The Chinese Communist Party, throughout the whole course of the alleged reopening, they've been opening things up and then closing them, sometimes within a few hours, sometimes 24 hours, sometimes a week or two. You may remember we talked about a few of these. One example would be them reopening the movie theaters and then mysteriously closing them all again without telling people why. Now, we also have a video of someone on the street laying on the ground. Looks like they may be dead. And there are people walking by this person looking very calm, like they're completely used to it. And this may be a pretty telling video of the idea that people in Wuhan, they seem used to seeing scenes like this. And also in Australia, the Daily Mail had an article. They're talking about how there's a flight heading from Wuhan to Australia with, quote, unknown cargo. It was a direct flight from Wuhan to Sydney, a Boeing 747 operated by Suparna, which is part of the Chinese-owned Hainan Airlines. Who knows what was on there? It may be passengers. We'll have to see. But on that note, too, even inside China, there are many people in different provinces who are very afraid of a second outbreak coming from the reopening of Wuhan. In Shanghai, for example. So a lot of the individuals who are leaving right now are allegedly heading 1 to Shanghai and 2 to Guangdong. A lot of people in Shanghai, at one point, say they're very worried about this. They're very concerned about this. Now, going on a bit into some other stories from China. Now, there's a potential humanitarian crisis taking place in Wuhan right now. They have emptied out the hospitals in order to play along with this narrative that Wuhan is free of cases, free of virus cases, and is now opening up. Actually, RFA had a good story in it. They said that hospitals have been forcibly cleared. And they say that even critically ill patients were sent home. Also, religious sites in Beijing at least are still closed down. The Epoch Times got some exclusive photographs showing this. Some famous temples, Buddhist temples, are closed down. And the China-Russian border is also closed. And it appears that Russia, at least based on what they're doing, seems to not trust the Chinese regime when it says this virus is over. So Beijing local news outlets were reporting this. They wrote that, quote, the Chinese embassy in Russia announced on April 8th that the Chinese embassy in Russia has learned from the relevant competent authorities of China and Russia that all personnel passages at China-Russia land border crossings have been temporarily closed. And also, this appears to be targeted specifically at Chinese people in Russia. It says, quote, the Chinese embassy in Russia reminded Chinese citizens in Russia to pay close attention to the above information, carefully abide by the Russian anti-epidemic regulations, do self-isolation, and avoid long-distance travel. And in addition to this, there were also reports from this Beijing news outlet again. On the afternoon of the 7th, April 7th, the Russian government website of the Primorsky Krai stated that 330 Chinese citizens who had been isolated in with a confirmed case of new coronavirus infection in the city of Ussuriska, sorry for my pronunciation, would be deported back to China. In other words, Chinese people living in Russia lost their Russian citizenship. They were repatriated to the Chinese citizenship. Now, the Chinese consulate is refuting these claims, but this article is still out, so we'll have to see which is the true case here. It does appear, based on these reports, though, that Russia is at least very wary of people coming into Russia from China. And if this case is true, it means they're sending people with the virus back to China, which could be why the Chinese regime does not want to acknowledge that. They would very likely not want to acknowledge that Chinese in Russia are losing Russian citizenship, being repatriated back to China, and being deported for having the virus, which means that Russia would be sending the virus, sending infected patients back to China, if that were the case. And meanwhile, we have some photographs from Heilongjiang, Jiangxi City. We have photographs showing that it's under lockdown again, and it's a very bizarre looking lockdown. You'll see what appear to be like makeshift wooden barriers with doors on them across the streets, and it's set up blocking off the streets, blocking off the sidewalks. And allegedly there are volunteer party members. They have red bands on their arms, a volunteer party, who are going around and checking people, checking their QR codes on their phone. You may remember we've mentioned before that in China, again, we talked about these 21 million fewer cell phones and why that was significant. Why 21 million cell phones suddenly disappearing in China, phone accounts suddenly disappearing in China is a big deal. It's because your cell account in China is tied to your social security number, tied to your bank account, and right now especially it's tied to your health code. If you have a green health code, you can travel. If you have a red health code, you cannot travel. So these individuals at these blockades in Heilongjiang province are checking people's health codes. Meanwhile, hostility from the Chinese Communist Party is continuing. Now, we had a very interesting article in the Epoch Times from one of our contributors, Trevor Loudon. And he wrote that the Chinese Communist Party has rallied 250 far-left parties to exploit the Chinese Communist Party virus, the CCP virus, for political gain. Now, he wrote that on April 2nd, the website of the International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China published a, quote, open letter calling for closer international cooperation in the fight against COVID-19. And according to the same-day report on CCP propaganda outlet Xinhua, one of the main state-run news outlets, at least 230 parties from over 100 countries had already endorsed or republished the letter. Now, this letter, he says, openly initiated by the Chinese Communist Party, then calls for, quote, coordinated policies and, quote, mobilization of resources and forces globally. Now, just as a quick note, the Chinese Communist Party, with these different international parties, kind of maintains an alternate international order. It has not disclosed who exactly these 230 parties are, although we do know some of them. They include, for example, the Communist Party of Cuba, the Communist Party of Nepal, South African Communist Party, the Progressive Party, Communist Party USA, Communist Party of Australia, and others. Also, Chinese cyber attacks are continuing. A new Chinese cyber attack against Linux servers was uncovered, which has allegedly been going on for 10 years. And the Chinese regime, through its state-run hackers, have been stealing information from that. Now, a quick note on Chinese cyber espionage. We all probably remember a few different cases. We know that the Obama administration had indicted 5 different Chinese military hackers. Who were they? Unit 61398. Unit 61398 was one of 22 known operational bureaus under the General Staff Department, 3rd Department of the Chinese military. The General Staff Department is the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military. Why was the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military launching cyber attacks to steal intellectual property from American businesses? Again, economic warfare, right? 3rd Department was the Signals Intelligence branch of the Chinese military. There's also Second Department, Human Intelligence, Fourth Department, Electronics Intelligence. Now, under Xi Jinping, they've folded this department, the General Staff Department, into a new department called the Strategic Support Force. Basically serves the same roles. Now, you may remember this recent case where I believe it was 4 different Chinese military hackers with the 54 Research Institute were also charged. Of course, you can't really bring them here to press charges, which is indicted, right? 54 Research Institute is different from the Third Department. In other words, this is a very different case from the one the Obama administration had indicted. 54 Research Institute was part of the Fourth Department, the Electronics Intelligence Department, and it was specifically focused on electronics warfare. And so why was the electronics warfare branch of the Chinese military launching attacks against Equifax? It was cyber attacks to steal things like social security numbers, banking information, and personal information on American citizens. Why were they stealing personal information on American citizens? And notably, too, there were credit card numbers and, of course, personal identifying information on individuals. No evidence that those were ever used for financial gain. No evidence that those were ever sold. So what did they do with them? Some things to consider. And now with this in context, the Justice Department is going after Chinese espionage groups in the United States. And they're not showing any signs of slowing despite this virus. Now the Justice Department is pushing for prosecutors across the U.S. to focus on Chinese Communist Party efforts to steal intellectual property. Now Politico actually had a story on this that was interesting. It notes that they are investigating American academics, they are investigating U.S. universities. You may have heard of individuals arrested, college professors who were working under the 1,000 Talents program. The Chinese Communist Party has many programs like this. Among them the 211 program, the 973 program, the Torch program, and guided programs like Project 863 and also China 2025, which they've now somewhat updated. Now, Politico claims that the Department of Justice wants each of the 94 attorneys' districts in the U.S. to bring cases on Chinese espionage stealing intellectual property. So very likely we'll start seeing a lot more of these cases coming out. Now, in terms of the scale of this, you can actually check out a presentation I gave on another channel I had started but actually folded into Crossroads. It was called the China Report. I actually broke down the whole system of Chinese academic espionage, all the different branches connected to it, all the different organizations the Chinese Communist Party uses for it, all the different programs they have to direct it. And I note many different cases we've seen over the last year. And I also note particularly that if the United States wanted to really go after these organizations, there are so many individuals who have been compromised. So many people in our academic institutions, so many people in, say, colleges, things like Confucius Institutes, things like professors who have sold out through the 1,000 Talents program, things like even business people selling out through the Torch program, students who got caught up in these programs. And you have politicians caught up in the United Front Department's work. If the United States were to go after the full scale of Chinese Communist Party subversion in the U.S., a very large number of people could be swept up in it. We'll have to see how thorough they're going to be with that. And now for some news from outside of China. There's an Italian mayor who's using drones to scream profanities at residents who are ignoring the lockdown. There's a video of it. They have these unmanned aerial vehicles, of course, these little remote drones, going around and yelling profanities at people if they're violating the lockdown orders, people going on the streets. Now, what's especially interesting about this is that this follows the model of the Chinese Communist Party. One of the narratives that the Chinese regime is spreading right now is that the China model, its system of totalitarian government, is the most effective system for fighting this CCP virus, this virus we have going around right now. And the Chinese Communist Party, as we've noted, contacting these 230 different far-left parties around the world, political parties, is trying to export this system, trying to promote this system, trying to get different countries to adopt it. Now, this mayor in Italy, who knows if he's following this, but this does play along with what the Chinese Communist Party was doing. Actually, the Chinese regime had videos also of these unmanned aerial vehicles chasing, say, old women on the streets and yelling at them. Now, moving on, Japan is funding firms to shift production out of China and back to Japan, or to Japan if they never manufactured there. In its budget, it includes $2 billion for companies to move production back to Japan. We're very likely going to see a whole lot more of this. Already seeing some cases in the U.S., and already we're seeing a lot of companies pulling out of China. And officials with the WHO are now saying that their budget should not be cut. And of course, the context of this is that the Trump administration, actually President Trump himself, gave a press conference where he said he was going to suspend the budget for the WHO. Of course, the United States finances a lot of it.
But we will look at ending funding. Yeah, because you know what? They called it wrong. And if you look back over the years even, they're very much, everything seems to be very biased toward China.
Now, this is a quote from Dr. Hans Kluge, WHO Regional Director for Europe. "We are still in the acute phase of a pandemic, so now is not the time to cut back on funding." Dr. Bruce Aylward, who you may remember from this Hong Kong journalist who was interviewing him and he cut her out, he said, quote, "It was absolutely critical in the early part of this outbreak to have full access to everything possible, to get on the ground and work with the Chinese to understand this." Total nonsense. The Chinese regime blocked the WHO from going on the ground. The Chinese regime gave them false information, which they broadcasted to the world, and that false information led many countries to be unprepared. So interesting words, not only cutting the funding to the WHO, but also possibly investigating whether it knowingly covered up, say, the danger of this virus to the world. Meanwhile, NBC News is being criticized for a tweet it published. U.S. reports 1,264 coronavirus deaths in over 24 hours. Meanwhile, in China, where the pandemic broke out, not a single new coronavirus death was reported. In other words, parroting the Chinese Communist Party's narrative that there's been no new deaths in China. Dan Bongino came out at them and wrote on Twitter, quote, "NBC goes all in on communist propaganda." Nick Short wrote, "And NBC News believes China's numbers. Hashtag stop the propaganda." There were many similar comments. Now, a few important points on this. One, this NBC report, it's unclear what their intentions were in saying this. Maybe they're just reporting what the claims were. Who knows? But this fits in very clearly with what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to spread right now in its own propaganda. They're trying to say again that the China model, the CCP's model of totalitarian government, of high-tech totalitarianism, using things like the social credit system, monitoring citizens, they're saying that this is the most effective way to fight the virus. They are promoting the China model. They are attacking the U.S. model. This is part of their narrative. NBC News publishing that does fall in with that narrative. Unclear whether they did it knowingly or not. And in another story from NBC News, it's now saying that, quote, "As far back as late November, U.S. intelligence officials were warning that a contagion was sweeping through China's Wuhan region, changing the pattern of life and business and posing a threat to the population." Now, this article cites 4 different unnamed sources who NBC alleges were briefed on this intelligence report. Now, it says it did not appear in the briefing to Trump until early January. In other words, it's saying that the Trump administration was alerted, at least by these intelligence reports, that a virus was spreading through Wuhan in China. Now, of course, it's unclear what the details are on this. An intelligence report can be a full report, or an intelligence report can be a little, 2-paragraph statement. It's unclear which it was. We do know that in China there were reports on this taking place, and it's very likely that the U.S. was aware of those reports. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, silenced a lot of those reports. So it's unclear how big of a report this was in the intelligence community. Now, there is broader context on this, which is that Adam Schiff right now is calling for an investigation into the Trump administration's response to the virus. So it's possible NBC's article is pushing that narrative, that Trump was aware of, this virus spreading and didn't act properly. Mike Pence had come out after Adam Schiff made those claims, told CNN actually, that what is to blame is the CDC and the Chinese Communist Party for lying to the world. Lying to the world about the seriousness of this virus, lying to the world that they had it under control, lying to the world about the deadliness of this virus. Even Iran is criticizing the Chinese Communist Party right now over the exact same thing. Now, on a more positive note, the CDC director, Dr. Robert Redfield, is predicting that the death toll in the United States will be, quote, much, much, much lower than initially projected. Now, he says that they are basing these estimates on models, and the models are based on the data they have. And really, the data they've had up until at least very recently has been very limited because the Chinese Communist Party has not been giving the data to other countries. He says predictions are lower now because Americans are following social distancing guidelines and that many businesses are closed. Now, he noted that some of these models estimated that only about 50% of Americans were going to be following these social distancing guidelines. That put the estimated deaths somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million in the United States. The Trump administration was estimating that about 100,000 to 250,000 on the low end in terms of death rate in the United States. And Trump said that if it's 100,000 dead in the U.S. from this virus, it will mean the U.S. did, quote, a very good job containing it. Now, Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, is saying the U.S. government will keep key medical supplies in the United States because, of course, there's higher demand for it right now, and the United States may need it. He said that because of internal needs, the U.S. will keep PPE, that's personal medical equipment, in the U.S. until domestic needs are met, and he will continue to provide medical assistance abroad. And there's also calls in the U.S. right now to have the supply chain for medicines, for pharmaceuticals, to return to the United States. Of course, China manufactures the majority of our medications. We're now seeing the impact of that. And also, the lawsuit filed against the Chinese Communist Party by lawyer Larry Klayman of Freedom Watch is now being considered by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Now, Klayman said, according to WND, that, quote, their crimes against humanity, referring to the Chinese Communist Party, over the COVID-19 pandemic are severe and mounting each minute. The world demands justice for the death and destruction they have caused and continue to cause. And WND notes the lawsuit, the complaint, names China, President Xi Jinping, not really president because he's not elected. The complaint names China, President Xi Jinping, and others for allegedly developing the coronavirus and allowing it to escape from their labs. Now, with that said, folks, if you haven't seen the documentary we did, Epoch Times and NTD, check it out. It's an investigative documentary looking into the origins of this virus. I have the whole thing published in the video section on this channel. Be sure to check it out. We look into the laboratories, we look into the research they were doing, we look into the Chinese Communist Party's systems of unconventional warfare, we look into who the individuals tied to it were, and I think you'll all find it very, very interesting. That said, of course, if you have questions or comments, leave them in the comments section. I do read them, and every Monday I'll be going through them and reading some of them on the show, answering questions and so on. And again, we'll be doing these broadcasts 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, focusing right now at least on this coronavirus, the CCP virus, giving you some insights into what's happening in China, giving you insights on what's happening abroad. And with that said, see you next time.